Today, my guest is Michael Cherkas, Toronto-based graphic designer, comic book artist, cartoonist, and graphic novelist. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Today, we're going to talk about your most recent graphic novel, Red Harvest, which is a historical family drama set during the Holodomor, the Soviet terror famine that engulfed Ukraine in early 1930s. So, Red Harvest is a powerful look at a tragic chapter in Ukrainian history. And I haven't read that many graphic novels, but first, when I heard that it's a graphic novel, it didn't really go together in my mind. Like when you think about something as tragic as Holodomor, you don't really think of graphic novels, especially because for me it's kind of similar to like comics. So, what inspired you to tell this story through the medium of graphic novel?
Just brief. I'll try to be very brief. I When I went to art school, I went to art school with the hope of becoming a cartoonist or comic book artist. But in this is back in the late 70s, and it was actually very difficult to become a comic book artist. Most comic books at that time in North America were superhero or pulp type fiction stories, westerns, romance, Archie type comics. But when so I did eventually get a chance to do a comic book in the late 80s, which was a more frivolous type of comic. Um, and I never really thought of doing anything about the Holodomor because it is a really difficult story to tell. But when I saw a graphic novel called Mouse by Art Spiegelman that came out in the late 1980s, I said the Holodomor could be a story as a graphic novel. You could tell that story within the constraints of a graphic novel, and but I never really considered doing it because most of my previous work is quite cartoony. And someone approached me, James Whaley, comic book colleague of mine from way back, called me up one day and wondered. Well, he asked me. He said to me, "Mike, I know you're Ukrainian. What do you know about the Holodomor?" And I told him I knew a fair bit. I was quite well versed in the history of it, and he was kind of interested in doing a comic or a graphic novel about the Holodomor, and we talked back and forth for 5 years. Eventually, he left the project and leaving me to do it alone. And I'm going to say, for the first 5 or 6 years, I felt quite uncomfortable trying to do it because I just didn't think I had the artistic chops to do the story. Once I got into it, I felt I could actually tell the story as a graphic novel.
Mhm. And it looks like this book is mostly for non-Ukrainians, so for people who are not that familiar with the topic of Holodomor. So, how did you approach presenting such a heavy, tragic, complex topic to a non-Ukrainian audience?
That was difficult to do because I didn't want to go down the road of doing a documentary where you said it, you say, well, at this point the Soviets did this, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened, right? So I wanted to incorporate all of that information, like the information about collectivization, the information about the law in August of 1932, the law of the five stalks of grain, and I wanted to, and the blacklisting of villages. I wanted to incorporate that within the story so that it didn't feel like a documentary, and that's why I chose to tell the story as a fictional account of a family in a fictional village in central Ukraine. I didn't want it to become a documentary in any way, shape, or form because I thought people would get caught up in details that they're not really familiar with. Because Ukrainian history is the only people that know Ukrainian history are Ukrainians. So
So, to try to be, like quite exact in the story and in the history, what kind of research went into the creation of Red Harvest? Are
Um,
there any specific, maybe survivor stories or historical accounts that influenced the storyline?
yeah, I looked at survivors' anecdotes that the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium has compiled. I looked at survivors' anecdotes in textbooks, um, so that I could get a sense of what it was like to actually live through that time. My research in terms of the collectivization and the decrees that came down from the Bolshevik Party, that's mostly through reading some academic textbooks, also popular histories. Like the most recent one that came out was Red Famine by Anne Applebaum, which is actually probably the best historical account for a non-Ukrainian to read because it really clearly explains the Holodomor. Prior to that, most of my books, the books that I were looking at were academic textbooks or books designed for university courses, and they're very dry. Um,
Okay, and like the graphic novel captures a lot of Ukrainian culture as well and traditions, the daily life, with lots of detail. So, how did you approach depicting these aspects authentically? Do you have any, like experience of traveling to Ukraine? Maybe when you grew up, you had some Ukrainian traditions? Or in general, how did you research this topic to depict accurately the Ukrainian lifestyle?
I think that comes from just growing up in a Ukrainian family. It's the funny thing in my family is that there were four kids, right? I was the youngest, and only my oldest brother is still fluent in Ukrainian. All of the other three children, myself, my older brother, and my older sister, we all kind of lost our fluency in Ukrainian. In fact, I think my parents gave up trying to teach me Ukrainian, even though they spoke to Ukrainian, they spoke to each other in Ukrainian, right? So, but I was in a family that maintained a lot of. We didn't. I'm not going to say that we were like really embedded in Ukrainian traditions, but we. My father was always impressing upon me, I guess, the importance of maintaining certain traditions. Right? There's certain things that. There's one scene in this story where it's the Ivana Kupala night. Um, and I incorporated that into the story specifically because when I was doing the research, I I read that the Soviets, even though they were while they were discouraging the traditional religions, they started to encourage pagan rites, pagan traditions, which the Ivana Kupala night is its roots are in pagan history. So I could see where that would become an event in the fictional village that I kind of imagined in the story.
I see. And can we go back for a moment to the topic of drawing? So, your style in Red Harvest has been described as raw and sketchy, which enhances the emotional intensity of the story. Could you share more about your artistic choices for this novel?
Yeah, I when I was doing it, I didn't think that my traditional, more cartoony style was that appropriate for obviously for a lot of reasons. It just wasn't appropriate for the Holodomor. And the my drawing style or my what I'm going to say my ability to draw in a really detailed, accurate fashion is not as great as say another. My draftsman abilities aren't as great as say many other comic book artists.
Mhm.
So I had to figure out how can I get this across, but still make it look um, authentic. And by doing the sketchy style, it kind of has, it almost has a sense of, it was as if it was drawn at the time and then surreptitiously snuck out of the Soviet Ukraine. So it's almost like it's a visual samizdat in a way, and that I think it does kind of feel like that.
Mm-hmm. There are so many takeaways you can take from the book, but if there was one thing you would like readers to remember after reading Red Harvest, what would it be?
Um, One thing that I'd like, I don't think this is actually is comes out in the book, but one thing I'd like people to understand is that this kind of tragedy, world-shaking tragedy, goes on all the time. The Holodomor isn't an isolated event in world history. Food has been used as a weapon many times. The British used it with the Irish. They used it with in India. It's being used in Africa. In China, Mao Zedong had repeated the Holodomor. He knew what happened, and he repeated uh, it. Like he took the playbook of Stalin and used it in China. Um, so I just like it's almost a universal theme.
Mhm.
Like this sort of tragedies befall people all over the world. The other takeaway I'd like people to especially non-Ukrainians, is it's a piece of history in Europe that many people don't know about, and I want them to take that away from it, to say yes, the Holodomor happened.
And for non-Ukrainians that probably don't know much about Ukrainian history, maybe this is the first time they are learning about Holodomor. How can readers who are inspired by Red Harvest further educate themselves about Holodomor or support Ukraine today?
Well, I think they can support Ukraine by supporting all the charities that are collecting money for Ukraine, or collecting medical goods or supplies to help Ukraine in their fight against the Russian invasion.
How can they educate themselves more in Ukrainian history and Holodomor history as well?
People who read graphic novels can actually read 3 other graphic novels about the Holodomor, if they're into reading graphic novels. Um, there's one that just came out that's published in America called In the Shadow of Stalin, which is about Gareth Jones, and it's based on the movie Mr. Jones. So it's a graphic novel adaptation of the movie Mr. Jones that came out in 2019. There's also another graphic novel by a cartoonist named Igor, called The Ukrainian and Russian Notebooks, in which the Ukrainian portion of it deals with the Holodomor more as its survivors' accounts, whereas my story is fictional. The story Ukrainian and Russian Notebooks, it's all the cartoonist Igor went to Ukraine and interviewed survivors of the Holodomor and recounts their story.
Great advice. Thank you. And I really hope that our conversation got some people interested in the book and hopefully in visiting the book presentation we're going to have. So, can you please tell our viewers a bit more about the book presentation we're going to have at Kunf Gallery on November 24th? And will the attendees be able to buy Red Harvest and get them signed?
Yes, Red Harvest. I'll have copies of Red Harvest available at the Kuhn presentation, and I will sign them. Just so people know, it's $25 a book is what they cost. So,
Okay, great. Thank you
okay.
so much for the conversation, Michael. I hope we managed to get our viewers interested and they'll come to the book presentation November 24th. So thank you again so much.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to it.
This was Art Talk. See you again soon.